The sun hung low over the Jackson, Mississippi courthouse, casting long shadows across the parking lot where sleek cars gleamed under the late afternoon light. Officer Ethan Grant stood near the entrance to the reserved section, his boots planted firmly on the asphalt, his chest puffed out with the kind of self-assuredness that only years of unchecked authority could forge. His sharp eyes, narrowed with a mix of disdain and suspicion, scanned the area like a hawk searching for prey. Ethan was a man who wore his badge like a crown, a middle-aged white cop whose worldview had been shaped by a lineage of lawmen, and a deep-seated belief that order was his to define. For him, justice wasn't a lofty ideal, it was a hammer, and he wielded it with relish against anyone who dared step out of the lines he'd drawn in his mind. Then he saw her. A black woman stepped out of an elegant, polished sedan, the kind of car that turned heads with its quiet luxury. Her tailored suit hugged her frame with precision, every seam a testament to her meticulous care, and her heels clicked against the pavement with a rhythm that spoke of unshakable confidence. To anyone else, she might have looked like she belonged someone important, someone with purpose. But to Ethan, she was an anomaly, a trespasser in a space he'd long ago decided wasn't meant for people like her. His jaw tightened as he watched her lock the car and stride toward the reserved area, her chin held high, her posture daring the world to challenge her. In his mind, she had no right to be there. Run it with that car, not in those clothes, and certainly not with that air of defiance that seemed to mock his very existence. A black woman, in his eyes, could never claim a place among the elite who parked in that exclusive lot. His heavy steps echoed as he marched toward her, each thud of his boots a declaration of his authority. She was almost at the gate when he planted himself in her path, a towering wall of prejudice dressed in a crisp uniform, his face twisted into a sneer, his pale eyes glinting with contempt as he barked, "Hey, you! Stop right there!" His voice was a jagged blade, rough and commanding, dripping with the kind of judgment that didn't bother with questions. He didn't ask her name or her business, didn't need to. To him, she was already guilty of something, and he relished the chance to prove it. "Who do you think you are? Waltzing in here like you own the place? What's your game? Trespassing? Trying to sneak into somewhere you don't belong?" She froze, her breath catching in her chest as his words hit her like a barrage of stones inside. A storm brewed anger, frustration, and the bitter sting of familiarity. She'd felt this before, the weight of someone's assumptions pressing down on her, trying to crush her spirit. But this time, it was different. This wasn't some random street corner or a dimly lit store where she could brush it off and keep moving. This was the courthouse, her domain, the place where she'd fought tooth and nail to carve out her rightful place. She took a slow, deliberate breath, willing her racing heart to steady, and met his gaze with a composure that belied the fire raging within her. Her fingers twitched toward her purse, instinctively reaching for the ID that would silence his accusations. But before she could even unzip it, he lunged forward. "Don't touch anything," he bellowed, his hand darting out as if to snatch the bag from her grip. "Keep your hands where I can see them. What are you hiding in there? Drugs? A weapon?" His voice was a thunderclap, loud enough to draw the attention of a few passersby who lingered near the courthouse steps. She clenched her jaw, swallowing the indignation that threatened to spill out. Her hands hovered in the air, steady despite the tremor of fury building in her chest. She wanted to scream, to unleash the torrent of words that would expose the absurdity of his actions. But she knew better. She'd learned long ago that anger from someone like her would only fuel a man like him. So she tried reason instead, her voice low but firm. She began, only to be cut off by his mocking laughter. "What are you?" he sneered, folding his arms across his chest with a smug grin. "Don't tell me you're about to spin some fairy tale about meeting someone important here, huh? I've heard it all before." He shook his head, his tone dripping with sarcasm as he leaned in closer, his breath hot with arrogance. "You know what I think? You're just another hustler trying to pull a fast one, thinking I'm too dumb to notice. Well, guess what? I see right through you." The humiliation burned deep, a searing heat that spread through her body like wildfire. Around them, the scene was starting to draw a crowd, curious onlookers whispering to each other, some pulling out their phones to capture the unfolding drama. The air grew thick with tension, every second stretching into an eternity as she stood there, Pinned under his gaze and the growing scrutiny of strangers, she felt cornered, her path blocked by this towering figure who seemed to take pleasure in her discomfort. The murmurs of the crowd buzzed in her ears, a mix of confusion and judgment that only deepened her shame, but she refused to crumble. With a trembling hand, she reached for her wallet again, this time managing to pull out her ID. She held it out to him, her fingers steady despite the storm inside her, but he didn't take it. Instead, he stared at her, his eyes cold and unyielding, searching for a crack in her resolve as some sign of fear or submission that would satisfy his need to dominate. He wanted her to break, to shrink under his power, and she could feel that desire radiating from him like a dark aura. Enough was enough. She straightened her spine, her voice cutting through the charged silence like a blade. "I'm here because I work here," she said, her tone unwavering as she locked eyes with him. "And you should think twice before throwing accusations around like that." But her words fell on deaf ears. Ethan didn't hear her, or maybe he didn't want to. To him, she was just a black woman daring to occupy a space he deemed off limits. With a rough shove, he pushed her back, forcing her to stumble slightly as her heel caught on the uneven pavement. The crowd gasped, their whispers growing louder, and a few more phones lifted to record the injustice unfolding before them. "Do you work here?" he scoffed, his voice rising with mockery. "What, as a janitor, or maybe one of those leaflet pushers out front? Because I know exactly how these people," he spat the words with venom, his lip curling in disgust, try to weasel their way into places they don't belong. "You're not fooling me with your little act." The shame flared again, a blazing ember in her chest, but she couldn't let it consume her, not now. She needed him to understand the colossal mistake he was making, needed to reclaim the dignity he was so determined to strip away. With a voice that carried the weight of her authority, she tried once more. "I'm a judge," she said, each syllable deliberate and clear. "This is my workplace, and I suggest you step aside before you make this worse for yourself." His response was a laugh aloud, grating cackle that echoed across the parking lot, drawing even more eyes to the spectacle. "A judge," he jeered, leaning in so close she could see the flecks of spite in his eyes. "Oh, that's rich. Why didn't I guess that sooner?" His tone was thick with sarcasm, his face inches from hers as he loomed over her, trying to intimidate her into silence. "I don't know what scam you're running, but it's not going to work on me. You're in deep trouble, lady, and I'm taking you down to the station right now." The threat hung heavy in the air, and the atmosphere crackled with tension. The crowd was fully invested now, their murmurs swelling into a chorus of shock and disbelief. What had started as a petty power play had spiraled into a public disgrace, and she could feel the weight of every stare pressing down on her. Her eyes burned with unshed tears, not of sadness, but of rage. She was Maya Brooks, a woman who'd clawed her way up from the modest streets of Jackson to stand as a beacon of justice. In this very courthouse, she'd faced prejudice before, felt its sting in the sidelong glances and whispered slights. But this was a new level of absurdity. This man, this officer drunk on his own authority, was about to learn a lesson he'd never forget. Her childhood had been a battlefield of small triumphs and crushing defeats, each one forging her into the woman she was now, a woman who'd graduated law school against all odds, who'd earned her place in these halls with sweat and brilliance, who'd become a judge not just for herself, but for every young black girl who dared to dream. And yet, here she was, reduced to a suspect in the eyes of a man too blinded by his own arrogance to see the truth. Ethan Grant, meanwhile, was a relic of a fading era, a cop whose family had patrolled these streets for generations, passing down a legacy of control masked as duty. He saw himself as a guardian of order, but his order was a warped vision where people like Maya could never rise above their place. To him, her success was an insult, a crack in the foundation of the world he'd built in his mind. As he stood there, taunting her, he was oblivious to the shift happening around him, the crowd's growing unease, the cameras capturing his every move, the tide of consequence creeping closer. Maya's mind raced. She could confront him now, lay bare his ignorance in front of all these witnesses, and watch his bravado crumble. Or she could wait, step into the courthouse where her title carried undeniable weight, and let the system he so revered deliver the blow. Either way, the lesson would be the same. Justice wasn't his to twist, and power, when abused, always came with a price. The air buzzed with anticipation as she weighed her choice, her heart pounding with the certainty that this momentously and raw as it was would ripple far beyond this parking lot, exposing the fragility of prejudice and the strength of those it sought to silence. The world Ethan clung to so fiercely was built on a foundation of biases he didn't even realize he carried. To him, the sight of black people behind the wheels of sleek, expensive cars stirred an instinctive suspicion, like a reflex he couldn't control. Groups of young people lingering together sent a shiver of unease through him, their laughter or chatter morphing into something menacing in his mind. And anyone who didn't fit neatly into the spaces he deemed appropriate, well, they deserved scrutiny. No questions asked. It wasn't malice, not consciously, but a quiet certainty that had settled into his bones over years of wearing the badge. That certainty now pulsed through him as he sat in his patrol car, parked beside the court's reserve lot, his eyes narrowing at the scene unfolding before him. Maya Brooks stepped out of her car, her movements graceful yet hurried. A woman who carried herself with an unshakable confidence that seemed to radiate from within. To Ethan, that confidence was a provocation. He didn't know her name, her story, or the weight of the title she bore. All he saw was a black woman in a pressed suit, exiting a car that gleamed under the midday sun, stepping onto pavement he'd silently claimed as his to guard. His chest tightened with a cocktail of emotion, anger, mistrust, and something sharper. Something that felt like a challenge to the order he upheld. Who was she to stride into this space as if she owned it? His fingers drummed against the steering wheel, a restless rhythm matching the rising heat in his veins. She wasn't just an outsider, she was a threat, a crack in the rules he'd sworn to enforce. Meanwhile, Maya's world was a whirlwind of its own. She had no inkling of the storm brewing in the officer's mind as she locked her car and slung her bag over her shoulder. Her morning had been a marathon, hers spent unraveling a tangled legal case, her thoughts still buzzing with the victory she'd wrested from it. Now, she was late, dangerously so, for a critical meeting at the courthouse just beyond the lot. Her phone vibrated relentlessly in her pocket, her assistant's voice crackling through the line with urgent updates about a last-minute shift. In the day's proceedings, she barely registered the patrol car idling nearby, its occupant a blur in her peripheral vision. Her focus was singular: get inside, find her notes, and step into the courtroom where she belonged. The reserved parking spot had been a small mercy, a lifeline in her chaotic day, and she'd taken it without a second thought. But Ethan couldn't let it slide. The moment her heels clicked against the asphalt, something snapped inside him. He was a man who thrived on authority, who savored the weight of his badge and the power it lent him. To him, power wasn't just a tool, it was a shield, a way to keep the world in line. And this woman, with her poised demeanor and her audacity to park where only the privileged few were allowed, was testing that shield. He shoved open his car door, the metal groaning under his grip, and strode toward her with purpose. His face was a mask of stern resolve, eyes glinting with the kind of intensity he reserved for suspects he was certain he'd corner. In his mind, she wasn't just trespassing on a parking space, she was trespassing on his domain. Maya rummaged through her bag, her fingers brushing past folders and pens as she hunted for the meeting notes she'd scribbled that morning. The air was warm, thick with the promise of spring, and she muttered a quiet curse under her breath for letting time slip away from her. Then came the voice, sharp, biting, like a blade slicing through the quiet. Hey, you there." Ethan's tone was ice-cold steel, laced with an accusation that hit her like a physical blow. She froze, her hands still buried in her bag, and slowly lifted her gaze to meet his. Confusion clouded her features, her brow furrowing as she tried to make sense of the hostility radiating from the man towering over her. His uniform gleamed in the sunlight, the badge catching a glint that seemed to mock her. "This is a restricted area," he barked, his voice swelling with the weight of his assumed dominion. "Who do you think you are, parking here, trying to sneak in without authorization?" Each word dripped with disdain, his lips curling as if her very presence offended him. Maya blinked, her mind racing to catch up. She'd faced this before, officers eyeing her with suspicion, their questions tinged with an edge she'd learned to recognize. But this felt different. This wasn't just doubt, it was aggression, a challenge she hadn't anticipated. She straightened, drawing on the calm she'd honed over years in courtrooms, and offered a faint smile, hoping to soften the tension coiling between them. "Hello," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt creeping into her chest. "I'm a judge here at this court. I'm just trying to get to an important meeting." She gestured toward the building, its stone facade looming like a silent witness to the unfolding scene. But Ethan wasn't listening yet really. Her words hit him like an insult, a lie to bold to stomach. "A judge," he scoffed, the sound harsh and jagged, cutting through her explanation. "Are you kidding me? Do you think I'm stupid?" He shook his head, his eyes narrowing into slits of contempt. "Anyone can claim they're a judge to weasel out of trouble. Where's your ID?" For a fleeting moment, Maya felt the ground shift beneath her. His tone wasn't just dismissive, it was venomous, designed to strip her down, to erase the authority she'd earned through years of grit and brilliance. She was no stranger to prejudice, but this was a raw, unfiltered assault, and it stung deeper than she'd expected. Still, she was Judge Maya Brooks, a woman who'd faced down chaos in her courtroom without flinching. She took a slow, deliberate breath, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. "Of course," she said, her voice a careful balance of firmness and courtesy. "I'll get my identification." She reached into her bag, her movements measured. But Ethan's patience had already frayed to nothing. To him, this wasn't a resolution, it was a standoff, and he was determined to win. He stepped closer, his boots scuffing the pavement, his presence looming as he invaded the bubble of space she'd claimed. "Drop the bag," he snapped, his voice rising to a near shout that echoed across the lot. "I don't trust you. I don't know what you've got in there. Let go." His eyes bored into hers, daring her to defy him, his hand twitching toward the cuffs at his belt as if he relished the thought of using them. Inside Maya, a fire flared, indignation hot and fierce, clawing at her restraint. This was her courthouse, her sanctuary, where she wielded justice with a steady hand. And yet here, in this sunlit parking lot, she was reduced to a suspect, her skin the only evidence this man needed to deem her guilty. Around them, a crowd began to gather, drawn by the escalating tension like moths to a flame. Whispers rippled through the onlookers, phones emerging to capture the spectacle, their lenses glinting like tiny, unblinking eyes. Maya felt their stares, a weight pressing against her shoulders, but she couldn't afford to crack. Not now. Not with Ethan poised to pounce, his certainty unshaken, his power a weapon he wielded without remorse. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, she realized as her pulse hammered in her ears. This was a reckoning about justice, about dignity, about the cost of being seen through a lens warped by bias. Ethan didn't see a judge. He saw a threat, a stereotype he refused to question. And in that refusal lay a deeper truth. Power, unchecked, could twist even the smallest encounter into a battlefield. Maya squared her shoulders, her resolve hardening. She'd show him who she was. Yes, but more than that, she'd show him what it meant to face the consequences of his own blindness. The fight was just beginning. Her hands trembled faintly as she stood there, the crowd's murmur swelling around her like a tide. She was no stranger to pressure, but this was a different beast-straw, personal and unrelenting. "Look," she said, forcing her voice to hold steady, "I'm telling the truth, sir. I'm a judge in this court, and I'm just trying to do my job. I'll get my ID from my bag if you'll allow me." She met his gaze, her dark eyes unwavering, a quiet challenge beneath her politeness. Ethan smirked, a dry, humorless sound escaping his lips. He wasn't buying it, not her words, not her composure. To him, she was a con artist spinning a tale, an intruder he'd unmask with righteous glee. "Allow you?" he sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You think you're in a position to make demands?" He leaned in, his shadow falling over her, his breath hot with the thrill of control. "Show me that ID you claim you have, because I'm done with excuses." Maya's fingers moved slowly, deliberately, as she opened her bag. Her heart pounded, a drumbeat of fury and frustration, but her face remained a mask of calm. She knew the stakes, any flinch, any misstep, and he'd twist it against her. The crowd pressed closer, their whispers a low hum, some holding up phones to immortalize the clash. Ethan reveled in it, the attention fueling his bravado. He was the star of this show, the guardian of order, and he'd make sure everyone knew it. When her hand emerged with her wallet, she flipped it open to reveal the golden badge nestled inside her name, her title. Etched in gleaming letters, Judge Maya Brooks. She held it up, letting the sunlight catch its surface, a silent testament to her truth. Ethan's eyes locked onto it, and for a heartbeat, doubt flickered across his fascia, crack in his armor. But then it vanished, swallowed by his stubborn refusal to yield. "Oh, no, no," he muttered, shaking his head as if shaking off a bad dream. "That's fake. You think I don't see through this? Stolen. Forged waiter. You're not fooling me." He stepped closer still, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "You think you can roll up in this fancy car, dressed like that, and trick me? Not on my watch." The air between them crackled, thick with tension, and Maya felt it coil around her like a vice. Every word he spat was a wound, a deliberate attempt to dismantle her. She wanted to shout, to demand the respect she'd earned, to shatter his arrogance with the force of her reality. But she couldn't, not yet. She'd learned long ago that justice wasn't won with raised voices, but with calculated steps. "So you think I'm lying?" she said, her tone even, though the effort cost her. A hint of sarcasm slipped through, sharp and fleeting, before she reined it in. "Why don't you call the court? Confirm my identity with them. I can wait." It was a dare, wrapped in civility, and she watched his reaction with the precision of a predator sizing up its prey. Ethan loafed a short, grating sound that echoed his unshakable confidence. He scratched his head, feigning deliberation, then wagged a finger at her like she was a child caught in a lie. "You think I've got time for games? I don't need to call anyone. I know you're type people who think they can skirt the rules and walk away clean. But guess what? I'm not letting you off that easy." The crowd buzzed louder, a chorus of curiosity and judgment, and Maya felt the weight of their eyes like a physical burden. Ethan stood firm, a wall of prejudice masquerading as duty, blind to the irony of his own overreach. But Maya saw it clearly. The more he dug in, the deeper he buried himself. His power was a house of cards, fragile beneath its bluster, and she'd topple it not with anger, but with the unyielding truth. Justice demanded it, and she'd deliver it, one measured move at a time. The consequences of his actions loomed, inevitable as the sun sinking below the horizon. And when they crashed down, they'd resound far beyond this parking lot. The air around Maya Brooks buzzed with a restless energy, thick with whispers that swelled into a rising tide of murmurs. Some voices carried a quiet support, a faint lifeline in the chaos, while others dripped with skepticism, questioning the heavy-handed tactics of the police officer looming before her. She shut her eyes for a fleeting moment, the world narrowing to the rhythm of her own breath as she fought to anchor herself. Her mind raced sharp, urgent thoughts colliding with the growing certainty that the situation was spiraling far beyond her control. She needed a plan, a way to navigate the storm brewing around her. But the weight of it all pressed against her chest like a tightening vice. A soft touch grazed her arm, pulling her back to the moment. An elderly woman, her silver hair catching the faint sunlight, stepped closer, her wrinkled hand trembling slightly as it rested on Maya's sleeve. "Honey, are you okay?" the woman asked, her voice quivering with a mix of outrage and tenderness. "This whole thing gets absurd." Her eyes, clouded with age but bright with compassion, searched Maya's face for some sign of reassurance. Maya managed a small, fleeting smile, a silent thank you woven into the curve of her lips. She didn't dare shift her gaze from Ethan, the officer whose presence crackled with barely contained fury. The tension between them hung heavy, a taut wire ready to snap, and Maya could feel it in her bones. He was a volcano on the verge of eruption. This could be her moment. She thought, a chance to end the standoff once and for all. "I'm not resisting your authority," she said, her voice cutting through the charged air with a newfound steadiness, though frustration simmered beneath every syllable. "I'm just trying to get to my job that's right here. Why don't you take a breath and actually hear me out?" She stood taller, her chin lifting slightly as she spoke, her words a plea wrapped in defiance. But Ethan wasn't interested in listening. Calmness wasn't his goal, control was. He craved a confession, a tremor of fear in her eyes, anything to cement his dominance in this uneven power play. His face twisted, a sneer pulling at his lips as he barked, "You think you can tell me what to do?" His voice boomed across the parking lot, bouncing off the concrete and drawing every eye within earshot. "You're nobody here, and I'm not falling for whatever game you're playing. Stay quiet and wait for backup or I'll have to." He cut himself off mid-threat, his hand twitching toward his belt as if instinct alone might finish the sentence. In the distance, the wail of sirens pierced the air, a sharp, insistent sound that grew louder with every passing second. Maya's stomach tightened. He'd actually called for reinforcements because of some baseless hunch she refused to let go of. She scanned the growing crowd around her, their faces a gallery of reactions, some flushed with indignation, others blank with curiosity, watching the scene unfold like it was a matinee performance. If Ethan wouldn't see reason, she realized, flashing her badge wouldn't be enough. She'd have to prove who she was in a way that left no room for doubt, a way that stripped his authority bare and laid his prejudice out for all to see. Anger pulsed through her, hot and fierce, mingling with a deep, gnawing sense of injustice. But beneath it all, a quiet certainty took root. Truth would win out. It always did, eventually. And this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about exposing a system that turned a blind eye to people like her, that thrived on silencing them. As the sirens closed in, their red and blue lights swept across the parking lot, painting the asphalt in frantic, flickering hues, Ethan's lips curled into a triumphant grin, his chest puffing out as if he'd already claimed victory. In his mind, he'd won, proven himself right, asserted his power. But he had no idea how wrong he was, how the ground beneath him was about to shift. Maya turned slowly, the crowd swelling around her, a sea of eyes waiting for her next move. She felt the words rising in her throat, heavy with purpose, ready to shatter the fragile illusion Ethan clung to. What could she say? What could she do to unveil the truth so starkly that even he couldn't deny it? The moment hung in the air, electric and inevitable, a crescendo building to a point of no return. Police cars screeched to a halt, their tires grinding against the pavement as the siren's blare reverberated in her ears, a relentless pulse that matched the adrenaline surging through her veins. Yet Maya's face remained a mask of composure, her dark eyes steady despite the chaos. Every second mattered now, and what she did next wouldn't just be for herself, it would be for every soul who'd ever been dismissed, humiliated, or erased by someone like Ethan. She could feel their ghosts in the air, urging her forward. Ethan, meanwhile, was practically vibrating with impatience. He flung his arms wide, a self-styled hero awaiting his ovation, as 3 officers stepped out of the vehicles. Among them was a woman officer. Daniels, her brow furrowed in confusion as she took in the scene, her sharp gaze darting between Ethan's smug expression and Maya's quiet resolve. "They're finally here," Ethan crowed, his voice dripping with satisfaction as he waved the newcomers over. "This woman has been trying to sneak into the court's reserved area, claiming she's a judge." He chuckled, shaking his head as if he'd just shared the punchline to a ridiculous joke. "Can you believe that? What a story." The other officers exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort palpable. Daniels, though, locked eyes with Maya, and something flickered in her expression, a spark of recognition, perhaps, or the faint stirrings of doubt. She stepped forward, her voice measured but firm. "Hold on, Ethan. You're saying she identified herself as a judge?" "Exactly," he shot back, his tone brimming with scorn. "She's pretending she works here. But I'm not buying it. We need to cuff her and haul her to the station now." He reached for his handcuffs, fingers brushing the metal with eager intent, but Daniels raised a hand, her gesture sharp and commanding. "Stop," she said, her patience visibly thinning. Ethan huffed, his frustration bubbling over, but he obeyed, albeit reluctantly. Daniels turned to Maya, her demeanor softening slightly. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, what's your name again?" Maya inhaled deeply, the air cool against her lips. This was a pivot point where everything would change. She met Daniel's gaze, then shifted her eyes to Ethan, whose face was flushed with a cocktail of rage and arrogance. Staying calm in the face of his venom was a battle in itself, but she squared her shoulders and spoke with a clarity that cut through the noise. "My name is Maya Brooks, and yes, I am a judge in this courthouse. I have every document to prove it, but your colleague here wouldn't give me the chance to explain." Ethan's expression crumpled. disbelief twisting his features as if she'd spoken in a tongue he couldn't comprehend. "That's impossible," he stammered, his voice rising in pitch. "She can't. Besh is pulling some kind of stunt. You can't seriously believe her." He flailed his arms, desperate to rally the others to his side, but they hesitated, their uncertainty growing. Daniel's eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation crossing her face as she stepped closer to Maya. "Let me see your badge," she said, her tone neutral but insistent. She took the offered ID, her fingers brushing against Maya's as she examined it in silence. The crowd held its breath, the moment stretching taut and fragile. When Daniels finally looked up, her face softened with a mix of respect and chagrin. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry," she said, handing the badge back with care. "This checks out completely." "It looks like there's been a serious misunderstanding here." Ethan recoiled as if he'd been struck, his bravado dissolving into a frantic, flailing desperation. No, this can't be right," he sputtered, retreating a step, his head shaking wildly. "She's tricking everyone. You can't let this happen." His voice cracked, the confidence he'd wielded like a weapon now reduced to a pitiful whine. Daniels turned to him, her patience replaced by a steely resolve. "Ethan, that's enough. You got this wrong, and the least you can do is own up to it." But Ethan wasn't ready to surrender. His eyes widened, his jaw slackening as if the fury inside him might spill out in a torrent. "You don't get it," he shouted, his words tumbling over each other. "These people always find a way to twist things, to slip through the cracks, and there it waste slip that laid his soul bare." Maya stepped forward, her voice low but resonant, each word a hammer striking stone. "These people. Mr. Grant, you mean people like me, black people, because if that's what you're saying, you're proving exactly what I've been fighting against." The crowd fell silent, her words hanging in the air like a storm cloud breaking open. Ethan's protests faltered, his voice shrinking to a whisper under the weight of her truth. Maya held his gaze, unflinching, as the red and blue lights danced across their faces. This wasn't just a victory over one man's arrogance, it was a lesson etched in the harsh glow of justice, a warning that power, when wielded without accountability, crumbled under its own rot. The consequences of Ethan's actions rippled outward, a stark reminder that the truth, once unleashed, could never be buried again. The air in the parking lot was thick with tension, a suffocating weight pressing down on everyone present. Ethan's eyes darted wildly, his breath shallow and uneven, betraying the storm of panic raging inside him. Sweat glistened on his brow, catching the faint glow of the streetlights, as his chest heaved with every ragged inhale. It wasn't the kind of fear that came from breaking the law or facing punishment for a misdeed. No, this was something deeper. More primal, a terror rooted in the crumbling illusion of control he'd clung to so fiercely. He was losing the one thing he'd always believed defined him, his power, his unshakable authority over those he deemed beneath him. And standing there, watching him unravel, was Maya, her steady gaze cutting through his forehead like a blade. She could see it all, way his bravado melted into desperation, the way his hands trembled as he grasped at the remnants of his dominance. But there was no sympathy in her eyes, only a quiet, resolute strength that seemed to grow with every second he shrank. Her voice, when it finally broke the silence, was low and measured, carrying a weight that made the air around them feel heavier still. "Tell me, Officer Grant," she began, her words deliberate, each one landing like a stone in still water. "How do you suppose the court will take it when they hear about this? When they learn that one of their own, a man sworn to uphold the law, stopped a judge, held her in contempt, and treated her like some common criminal, all because of the color of her skin? What do you think they'll say when they realize you twisted your badge into a weapon, parading your prejudice in front of a crowd for all to see?" Ethan's fellow officers, among them, stood frozen, their faces a gallery of shock and unease. The weight of her words settled over them like a fog, thick and unyielding. This wasn't just a slip-up, a momentary lapse in judgment that could brush off with a reprimand. This was a seismic fracture, a scandal that would ripple far beyond Ethan himself, threatening to stain the reputation of the entire Jackson police force. Daniels, a seasoned officer with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tight. He'd seen Ethan strut around with that cocky air before, But this was different. This was a reckoning, and he knew it would leave scars. Ethan, meanwhile, felt the ground slipping out from under him. His wide eyes glistened with a mix of disbelief and dread, his career unraveling before him like a thread pulled from a tapestry. "Please," he stammered, his voice quivering, barely above a whisper, to "didn't know." The words spilled out in a rush, feeble and frantic, as if he could somehow claw his way back from the edge. "I thought," he thought. "You thought I was nobody," Maya cut in, her voice steady and unflinching. Her eyes locked on his without a flicker of hesitation. "That's what stings, isn't it? You saw me as powerless, just another target for you to push around. And now that you see how wrong you were, you think a quick apology will erase it all, don't you? That I'll just let it slide and you can walk away unscathed?" The crowd encircling them stood in stunned silence, a sea of faces reflecting a kaleidoscope of emotions. Some had tears welling in their eyes, glistening under the dim light, moved by the raw courage unfolding before them. Others gripped their phones with white-knuckled intensity, fingers trembling as they recorded every word, every gesture, determined to preserve this moment of truth. Ethan's shaking grew worse, his knees threatening to buckle under the weight of his own humiliation. The woman he'd tried to degrade, to strip of dignity with his barked orders and sneering disdain, now towered over him not in stature, but in presence. She was a force he hadn't anticipated, a storm he couldn't outrun. "To apologize," he mumbled, his voice cracking, hollowed out by defeat. "I really didn't mean," but the words sounded empty, like the plea of a man who already knew the battle was lost. Maya let the silence stretch for a moment, her gaze piercing through him, assessing the wreckage of the man before her. Then, with a calculated grace, she turned to Daniels, her posture unwavering. "I want every second of this documented," she said, her tone firm but calm, a command wrapped in quiet resolve. "Every word he's said, every move he's made. I'm taking this to court, and I'll make damn sure this man never hides behind that badge again with this kind of hatred in his heart." Daniels nodded, his expression hardening into something steely and resolute. "Leave it to me, Mrs. Brooks," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of duty. "We'll see it through." He wasn't just agreeing, it was committing. Daniels had spent years on the force, seen plenty of ugly moments swept under the rug. But this was a line crossed that couldn't be ignored. He felt the sting of shame, too, not just for Ethan, but for the system that had let this fester unchecked. For Ethan, that moment was the final blow. Clarity hit him like a cold wind slicing through a phobe knew his days as an officer were done. There was no salvaging this, no talking his way out. As the crowd began to drift apart, their murmurs buzzing like distant static, Maya felt a burden lift from her shoulders. It wasn't just about her own vindication. This was for every soul who'd been diminished, labeled, and dismissed by a world too quick to judge. Standing there, surrounded by the fading echoes of the confrontation, she tasted a justice that transcended courtroom walls, a justice that struck at the heart of those who thought themselves untouchable. But the story didn't end there. The stage was set for something bigger, a shift that could ripple through the city, maybe even beyond. What would happen when this truth spread, when it reached every shadowed corner and quiet street? Maya's next move, whatever it might bepromise to be, a spark no one saw coming. The tension between them had felt eternal, a frozen slice of time where every breath seemed to hang in the air. The crowd, once a restless murmur of confusion, now held its collective breath, eyes wide and waiting. Ethan stood encircled not just by strangers filming his downfall, their phone screens glowing like tiny beacons of accountability, but by his own colleagues, men and women in the same uniform who now looked at him with something akin to pity or disgust. The realization crashed over him. He wasn't the protector he'd imagined himself to be. Maya, unyielding, her stance firm and her eyes blazing, had become the embodiment of justice, a force he couldn't shout down or intimidate into submission. "Maya," he croaked, his voice barely audible, a broken sound that pleaded for mercy he hadn't earned. In mere minutes, he'd plummeted from swaggering arrogance to a trembling shell of himself, the weight of his fall stripping him bare. "I really thought he thought I was doing the right thing. Please, I never meant for this." Her response was unflinching. She stood tall, every muscle taut with a controlled fury she'd honed through years of quiet endurance. She'd faced prejudice, forcible slights, and overt disdain, but nothing like this. Nothing so brazenly public. This wasn't just her fight. It was a chance to hold a mirror up to the world, to force Ethan to see the cost of his actions. "Did you think you were doing the right thing, Ethan?" she asked, her voice clear and piercing, laced with a pain that cut deeper than anger. "You didn't even ask my name. You didn't care who I was. All you saw was a black woman you thought didn't belong. And now you expect me to shrug it off? To call it a mistake and let you walk away?" He opened his mouth, grasping for words, but nothing came. Each syllable she spoke tore through the flimsy shield of his excuses, laying his biases bare for all to witness. Daniels, standing off to the side, felt his stomach twist. He'd always had his suspicions about Ethan's brashness, the way he wielded his authority like a club. But seeing it exposed like this, raw and undeniable of the bitter taste. "Ethan, stop," he interjected, his voice gruff but steady, slicing through the stifling quiet. "We're recording everything. This is going to the chief. If I were you, I'd start thinking about what comes next." Maya took a step closer, her presence overwhelming despite her calm exterior. She could feel the ache of injustice in her bones, a familiar weight she'd carried too long. But now, she wielded it like a weapon. This wasn't just her moment, it was a clarion call for everyone who'd been silenced. A chance to dismantle the rot festering in places of power. "You might not get it yet, Ethan," she said, her words slow and deliberate, heavy with meaning. "But this isn't just about me. It's not about you pulling me over or trying to prove something. It's about every person who gets judged before they can speak. Every life you think you can trample because you've got that badge." That she pointed at the gleaming metal pin to his chest should stand for safety, for fairness. But you used it to hide your own cowardice, your own hate. Ethan's breath hitched, his hands shaking uncontrollably as the crowd's stares bore into him. There was no escaping it, no denying the truth she'd laid bare. The shame burned hot in his chest, mingling with a fury he couldn't unleash. He wanted to beg, to bargain, but Maya's raised hand stopped him cold. "No," she said, her voice a wall he couldn't breach. "You've said enough. Now it's my turn." Daniels watched, his recorder capturing every beat of the exchange. He knew this could redefine the force them to confront the ugliness they'd too often ignored. The crowd, too, felt the shift. People who'd once stood by, resigned to watching wrongs unfold, now straightened, their faces alight with a quiet hope. Maya had ignited something of fire that could spread. A lesson in the cost of unchecked power and the enduring strength of those who rise against it. The air in the sprawling parking lot was thick with tension, the kind that clung to your skin and made every breath feel heavy. Maya stood there, her voice cutting through the stillness like a blade, reverberating off the cracked asphalt and bouncing against the rows of parked cars. "I know so many of you have felt this," she declared, her words carrying the weight of a lifetime of frustration, anger, and unspoken truths. "I know how it feels to be pulled aside, interrogated, treated like you're less than human because of the shade of your skin, or the way you carry yourself. I've seen it, I've lived it, and I'm done letting it slip into the shadows. This isn't just another story to be buried and forgotten. Not this time. And you, Officer Grunt, you are going to face the reckoning you've been dodging for far too long." Ethan stood a few feet away, his uniform suddenly feeling like a flimsy shield against the storm brewing around him. Beads of sweat trickled down his forehead, stinging his eyes as his trembling hands betrayed the panic surging through him. His heart pounded in his chest, a frantic rhythm that matched the chaos unfolding in his mind. He'd never pictured this, never imagined a day when the badge he wore with pride could turn into a target, when the authority he'd wielded so casually could be stripped bare and questioned. Yet here he was, exposed and defenseless, the truth crashing down on him like a tidal wave. "You can make this right, Maya," he stammered, his voice cracking as desperation clawed at his throat. "Please, just give me a chance to fix this. I'll redeem myself, I swear." His words tumbled out in a frantic jumble, a plea for mercy he hoped might salvage the wreckage of his crumbling world. Maya's response was sharp and unyielding, a dry laugh escaping her lips not from amusement, but from the sheer absurdity of his request. "Redeem yourself," she echoed, her tone laced with incredulity and a bitter edge that cut deeper than any blade. "No, Ethan. It doesn't work like that. You don't get to spend years wielding your power like a weapon, humiliating people, judging them by the color of their skin, and then think a quick apology can wipe the slate clean. That's not how justice operates. You've got to face the consequences of what you've done. You've got to feel the weight of it, understand the pain you've caused, and answer for it in full. Her eyes burned with a fire born of righteous fury, a resolve that refused to bend under the pressure of the moment. From the sidelines, Daniels stepped forward, her presence a quiet but commanding force. She was a seasoned officer, her face etched with lines of experience and a weariness that spoke of too many battles fought. Her hand landed on Ethan's shoulder, firm and unyielding, the chill of her touch seeping through his uniform like a warning. "Let's go, Ethan," she said, her voice low but steady, carrying the finality of a judge's gavel. "You're answering for this in the internal court. Brace yourself, things are about to shift, and not in your favor." Her grip tightened briefly, a silent signal that her patience had run dry, that she'd seen enough to know this couldn't be swept under the rug. In that fleeting moment, Ethan felt the ground beneath him give way, as if the earth itself was swallowing him whole. His career, his identity, everything he'd built it was unraveling before his eyes, thread by thread. He stumbled slightly as Daniels guided him away, the other officers falling into step around him like a somber procession. For Maya, though, this was only the first ripple in a much larger wave. She stood tall, her stance unwavering, watching as Ethan was led off. Her chest ached with a mix of lingering pain and fierce determination, a storm of emotions swirling within her. This wasn't the end, it was the beginning of something far greater, a cry for justice that would echo beyond the confines of this parking lot, beyond the city limits, rippling through time and space. She knew the road ahead would be treacherous, a battlefield strewn with challenges, but she also knew she wasn't alone. With every step toward the courthouse, she felt the weight of a new fight settling on her shoulders, a fight for truth, for respect, for a world where equality wasn't just a distant dream. As Ethan disappeared from view, the tension in the parking lot began to ease, like a storm cloud slowly drifting away. Yet for Maya, the taste of justice wasn't as sweet or soothing as she'd hoped. It was a bitter victory, tempered by the knowledge that this was merely the opening act of a long, grueling saga. She lingered for a moment, her gaze sweeping over the now empty expanse of pavement, the scattered cars glinting under the harsh midday sun. The echoes of her words still hung in the air, mingling with the distant hum of traffic. Then, with a deep breath, she turned and walked toward the courthouse, each step deliberate, her mind racing with the enormity of what lay ahead. Anger simmered beneath her resolve, frustration gnawing at her edges. But there was also a spark of purpose, a vow to ensure no one else's story would be silenced, no other injustice brushed aside. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere buzzed with a frenetic energy. Word of the confrontation had spread like wildfire, racing through the halls and igniting whispers among co-workers, lawyers, and even the security guards stationed at the doors. Nervous glances darted between them, their eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and unease as they pieced together the drama that had unfolded just beyond the building's walls. Maya had always been a figure of quiet strength here, fair, measured, a steady hand in the chaos of the legal world. But now she'd thrust herself into the spotlight, transforming a routine abuse of power into a blazing indictment of systemic bias. Some admired her courage, whispering praises in hushed tones. Others clucked their tongues, insisting she'd overstepped, that she should have let the moment pass quietly. But none of them could glimpse the storm raging inside her, the constant need to prove her worth, to assert her dignity in a world that too often questioned it. Every sidelong glance, every murmured comment, was a reminder of the tightrope she walked, balancing fury and restraint, seeking change without letting bitterness consume her. The courtroom doors swung open, and Maya stepped inside, her presence commanding the space. Waiting there was Clara, her young assistant, whose pale face was flushed with a mix of anxiety and awe. Clara was a bright-eyed lawyer, barely out of her 20s, with a mop of chestnut hair and a fierce admiration for Maya that shone through her every word. Today, though, she seemed rattled, her hands fidgeting as she shut the door behind her and hurried over. "Maya, to heard what happened out there," she said, her voice trembling slightly. as if the weight of the moment was too much to hold. "It's just I don't even know where to start. What he did, it's awful, indefensible." She paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound hollow, her green eyes wide with concern. "I just want you to know, whatever you need, I'm here. Anything at all." Maya met Clara's gaze and offered a small, weary smile. It warmed her to see that loyalty, that unwavering support, but a pang of sadness tugged at her heart. Clara could stand by her side, could fight tooth and nail for her, but she'd never truly grasped the bone-deep exhaustion of living this realitized daily grind of prejudice that shaped every interaction, every glance. It wasn't Clara's fault. It was simply the divide between their worlds. "Thank you, Clara," Maya said softly, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. "I appreciate Thatrili. I'm okay, or I Wilkesby." She dragged a hand across her face, as if she could wipe away the sting of the morning's events. "But this isn't over. We've got work to do. This is going to be a long haul, and I need to see it through." Clara nodded, though worry still creased her brow. She knew Maya's resolve would thrust the entire court system into the fray, shining a harsh light on practices too long ignored. Some would see it as a personal vendetta against the police, not the principled stand it was. The thought of wading into that mess made Clara's stomach twist, but she couldn't deny the rightness of it. "What do you think will happen to Ethan?" she asked, her voice tentative, almost fearful of the answer. "He'll face some kind of punishment, won't he, after all that?" Maya sighed, the uncertainty of it gnawing at her. "I don't know, Clara," she admitted, her tone grave but resolute. "That's the hard truth. Ethan's got years on the force, connections, a system that's built to protect its own. Even with everything laid bare, he'll fight to slip through the cracks. But I'll tell you, the seam not letting it go. I'll push until he faces real consequences, until this becomes a line in the sand. It's not just about him, it's about showing that this kind of behavior, this abuse of power, won't be tolerated anymore. Not by the police, not by anyone." Her words carried a steel that left no room for doubt, a promise etched into the air between them. Clara dipped her head in agreement, her uncertainty giving way to a flicker of inspiration. She'd always known Maya was a force, but seeing her no unshaken, unbowed lit something within her. This was bigger than fear, bigger than the tangled web of the system they faced. In the days that followed, the ripples of that parking lot showdown spread far and wide. Jackson buzzed with the news, and soon the whole state of Mississippi was alight with it. Grainy cell phone videos popped up online, shared and reshared until they dominated feeds and headlines. Debates erupted. Some hailed Maya as a hero. Others branded her a troublemaker, but every voice added fuel to the fire of a reckoning long overdue. Maya threw herself into the fight, burning the midnight oil as she pored over documents, gathered witness accounts, and rallied support from colleagues who shared her vision. She was gearing up for a showdown with the Jackson Police Chief, Thomas Warren, a man whose stern face and rigid ideals were as unyielding as the oak trees lining the city streets. When the day of their meeting arrived, she stepped into his office, the air thick with unspoken tension. Warren rose to greet her, his gray eyes sharp but shadowed with unease. "Judge Brooks, thank you for coming," he said, his voice clipped, formal. "I'm truly sorry about what happened with Officer Grant last week. It's a mess, and we're sorting it out." His words hung there, heavy with the weight of a system straining under its own flaws. And Maya braced herself for the battle ahead, where justice and the consequences of power would be laid bare for all to see. Maya Brooks sat at the polished oak table, her back straight as an arrow, her hands folded firmly in front of her. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and old paper, a mix of bureaucracy and tension hanging thick in the air. She wasn't here to listen to hollow apologies or meaningless platitudes. No, she had come with a purpose burning deep in her chest to ensure that something, anything, would be done. Her dark eyes locked onto Chief Warren's weathered face, unwavering, as she spoke. "What happened was beyond unacceptable," she said, her voice steady, yet laced with an authority that seemed to ripple through the room. "It wasn't just a violation of rights as a judge, it was an assault on my dignity as a human being. And I need you to understand, Chief, this isn't about one rogue officer. This is about a festering culture that's been allowed to grow unchecked, a system that's overdue for reckoning." Chief Warren shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers drumming lightly against the edge of the table. He was a man caught between duty and dread, his graying hair catching the dim light of the boardroom as he weighed his words. He agreed with Herho, could he not? But the flicker of hesitation in his tired eyes betrayed him. Admitting that Officer Ethan Grant's actions were steeped in racism wasn't just a personal confession, it was an indictment of the entire Jackson Police Department. To acknowledge that Ethan's behavior wasn't an isolated incident, but a symptom of something deeper, would tarnish the force's reputation, a stain Warren wasn't ready to face without pushing back. "Judge Brooks," he began, his tone measured, almost rehearsed, "I hear your frustration. And believe me, I feel it too. But this is a delicate situation. We're committed to fairness for everyone involved. Officer Grant has a spotless record. Years of service without a single mark against him." Maya cut him off, her voice slicing through his excuses like a blade. "A clean record isn't a shield, Chief. It doesn't erase what he did. It's not a free pass to trample over people's rights." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze piercing. "I'm not here to safeguard reputations or coddle egos. My priority is protecting the people who've been failed by this system, people who deserve better than empty promises and half-hearted investigations." The air between them crackled, heavy with unspoken stakes. Warren's jaw tightened. He knew every word he uttered could be wielded against him. Yet he also understood that yielding too easily would spark a revolt within his own ranks. "We'll look into it thoroughly," he said at last, forcing a note of assurance into his voice. "I give you my word that we'll take the right steps. But I'm asking for time to handle this properly." Maya gave a curt nod, but the ice in her stare told a different story. She tasted the bitterness of doubt on her tongue as she rose from the table, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Warren's promises felt flimsy, like paper boats tossed into a storm. She knew the fight for justice was only beginning, and as she stepped out of that stifling boardroom, a resolve hardened within her. The system she was up against was a stubborn beast, resistant to change. But she wasn't alone anymore. Eyes were watching, colleagues, citizens. The press and that scrutiny was a weapon she could wield. It was a small triumph, but a triumph nonetheless. Weeks later, the case exploded far beyond the confines of Jackson. What started as a confrontation in the courthouse parking lot, a moment where Ethan Grant's arrogance and prejudice had boiled over, morphed into a national firestorm. Every revelation from the internal investigation became fodder for heated debates on television, radio, and across endless X threads. The pressure on the Jackson Police Department grew suffocating, a weight that pressed down on Chief Warren until he could no longer ignore it. Protecting Ethan, he realized, would mean dragging the entire force into the mud. At a press conference packed with reporters, their cameras flashing like a swarm of fireflies, Warren stepped up to the podium. His face was grim, his shoulders slumped under the burden of what he had to say. After a rigorous review, he announced, his voice steady but hollow, "Officer Ethan Grant has been terminated from the Jackson Police Department. He will lose his badge, his benefits, and his standing. His actions were a betrayal of our values." For Ethan, the fall was swift and brutal. Once a towering figure cloaked in the authority of his uniform, he now stood stripped bare, a pariah in the public eye. The disciplinary process had been relentless, peeling back layers of excuses to reveal the ugly truth. His behavior wasn't just a mistake, it was a disgrace. The evidence was undeniable, a spotlight too bright to escape. In the streets of Jackson, where tension had once simmered like a pot ready to boil over, people gathered not in fear, but in celebration. Voices rose in unison, cheering a justice they'd long been denied. For Ethan, the shame was a heavy cloak he couldn't shed. The badge that had once been his armor was gone, and with it, the life he'd known. He slipped away from the city under the cover of night, a broken man retreating from a world that had turned its back on him. Maya, meanwhile, felt the weight of her victory settle over her like a mantle. Her unwavering stand had transformed her into a beacon not just in Jackson, but across the nation. People whispered her name with reverence, her story igniting hope in hearts far beyond Mississippi's borders. Invitations poured in, law schools eager to hear her speak, community forums hungry for her insight. social justice rallies craving her presence. She took to each stage with the same fire that had fueled her in that boardroom. Her words a call to arms against racism and the abuse of power. She didn't just demand change, she carved a path for it, urging others to join her in building a system that served all, not just the privileged few. Then came the call that stopped her in her tracks. The governor of Mississippi was on the line, his voice crackling with a mix of admiration and urgency. "Judge Brooks," he said, "we've seen what you've done, what you stand for. The state needs someone like you, someone who embodies justice and equality. I'm offering you the role of Chief Justice of the Mississippi Supreme Court." It was a historic moment, the first black woman to hold the position in the state's long, tangled history. Maya's breath caught in her throat as she considered the enormity of it. The responsibility was daunting. Every ruling she made would be dissected, every misstep magnified. But she also saw the promise it held, a chance to reshape laws, to root out corruption, to ensure that no one else endured what she had. With a heart full of pride and a spine steeled by determination, she accepted. Chief Warren, too, found himself changed by the tide Maya had set in motion. The man who'd once faltered under pressure now stood taller, driven by the community's outcry and Maya's relentless push. He overhauled the Jackson Police Department from the ground up, mandatory training on racism and equity, a zero-tolerance stance on discrimination, a vow to uphold the law for everyone. He'd learned a hard lesson. Shielding his officers didn't mean excusing their wrongs. It meant holding them to a higher standard. His transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal. A quiet acknowledgement that he'd been part of the problem for too long. Maya's ripple effect stretched far beyond Jackson. Her story sparked conversations in coffee shops, classrooms, and courtrooms nationwide. People began to question the role of police, the meaning of justice, the cost of unchecked power. Every time she stepped into the courtroom or raised her voice at a podium, she carried the weight of those discussions, knowing she was paving a road for others to follow. The fight wasn't over. There would be more battles, more injustices to face, but she was ready. With every fiber of her being, she believed that courage and justice could rewrite the future. In the quiet moments, Maya reflected on the lesson at the heart of it all. Power, when abused, crumbles under its own weight. Ethan's downfall was proof his badge hadn't protected him from the consequences of his actions. Justice, she knew, wasn't a gift handed down. It was a fire stoked by those brave enough to demand it. And as she looked out at the world she was helping to shape, she felt a certainty deep in her bones. Real change wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. As long as people like her kept fighting,